Hi, I'm John, and in this video, we'll see how to create our first navigation menu using good practices with auto layout and build our first header. Okay, so we're going to start with the very basic concepts. We're going to recreate, for example, this first header, okay? We're going to start with our navigation menu. Remember, we're going to start from the inside out, always moving from the smallest elements to the largest ones. So let's replicate this header, shall we? Header, okay? We're always going to start from the inside, working our way outwards. So we're going to start with the text elements. We'll position our home item. Okay? We're going to say this is a medium-sized text from our styles that we've already created previously. I'm going to duplicate this home text. Let's make sure to capitalize the service items, for instance. We're going to place, for example, the About page here. For this purpose, we are going to utilize auto layout. All we need to do is simply select everything and then press Shift+A, alright? In this case, we can already see that we have different elements. If we organize them correctly, we can now utilize the gaps, for example, a medium space, okay? You can also use padding, for instance. In this case, a small space or another small space. We can use a fill, add a background. Now we have a good structure for our navigation menu. However, to ensure our menu is truly scalable, we need to take a few additional steps. So we're going to undo this, meaning we'll ungroup it. Alright, we now have our elements, specifically our text components, separated once more. We are now going to add an auto layout feature to each one of our text elements. Every single one of our text components, we want them all to have auto layout. Why do this? So we can work with each one of them individually. For instance, for each of them, I'm going to select them all and say that it's going to have a gap, for example, of 10. It's going to have a padding, for instance, of a small space. And right here, a padding of space S, okay? After that, we can specify that for the vertical alignment. Extra small. Okay, now we're going to select all of it, and then we're going to press Shift+A. Now we have our navigation menu ready. In this case, it's the nav, alright? Here we have our frames, which are menu items. Always remember to rename everything so that you maintain the correct structure, okay? In this specific instance, it's the text from our a menu item. Why did we decide to do this way? Well, it's because now we'll be able to easily add different styles to each and every one of these individual menu items. For instance, regarding the services menu item, we can decide that when it has a hover state applied, okay? We are going to proceed with adding a border around it. And there, for example here, and I want that border to have a primary color, okay? And I want this services text to be the primary color, okay? And for the rest of them, I also need to assign them their color. For instance, in this particular case, I'm going to add a specific text color. And now, I've been able to work with this element individually, successfully adding a top border to give it a more refined effect. Alternatively, to achieve a more traditional look, for instance, we could apply a bottom border and inferring from the context here, like this one, for instance, which would also be the most traditional approach, or we could simply add a bottom border with a specific color to all of them. In this case, I'm going to apply a border color that's light. There we go. Now, all of these elements here have I'm going to create a frame right here so that we can visualize it much better. Our navigation with all of its borders. Alright, so here we were able to successfully add different styles to each one of our elements. So let's say, as we can clearly see here, we are able to easily utilize borders, padding, various colors, or even distinct backgrounds. For example, I want this one to have a background on hover, okay? Like, for example, of primary light, okay? Or alternatively, ultralight. For instance, we can have it set up just like this. We can incorporate a gap into our auto layout, for example, an XS gap, and then to each of these individual elements, I can apply a border radius of a pill shape. There we have it, completely finished. I'm going to remove, for example, I'll say that the borders. okay? For instance, let's go ahead and remove all the borders now. We're going to hide the borders, and for this one, I'll also hide the border. I'm going to hide all the borders here. I'm going to add a color, for example, to these elements, specifically a fill color of ultralight, for example. And for this, we've got our light color fill already set up, which is really good. Therefore, this approach grants us significantly greater flexibility when it comes to designing and structuring our menu. Understand? Normally, we would just create this using text elements within a simple top-level auto layout or a basic group. However, it's actually a much better and more flexible approach to use this specific type of structured menu item for each individual element that makes up your menu. Now let's go ahead and create a submenu. How exactly do we go about doing this? We're going to bring in a. For example, this vector graphic we have right here for our little arrow. We're going to go ahead and paste it inside our auto layout, alright? We can give it its color. Well, for example here, let's use the primary color to follow the example. So, we have our icon now, and to add a submenu to our navigation, we're going to place it right inside that menu item. You see? This is how it's done. That's another reason why it's so important to use menu items, because we can add submenus correctly. So, for example, I'm going to go ahead and add a submenu right here. For instance, I'll place services here, among other options. Alright, so we're going to put, for instance, web design right here. Let's add a subservice of, alright, we have our different services. For each of these services, or rather these submenu items, we are also going to apply an auto layout. Shift A, Shift A. And each one of these is going to be a menu item. Okay, we have our items. Select all, Shift A, Auto Layout. In this specific case, it will function as the submenu. Nav, which would be our submenu. Alright, we have it here. For example, we can define a width for it over here. Let's say that all the auto layouts should have this same direction. Like this specific one right here. And we're going to ensure that each one of them has a fill width. That's exactly what we're aiming for. Hug. Okay. We have our submenu here. We have our menu items. We can also play around with it now. For example, in this particular instance, I can specify that it should have a fill of the primary color, ultralight, and that the text should be of a certain color. Primary. Alright, we now have our elements. For instance, here I can specify that it should have an effect. Now let's go ahead and add our L effects. Let's go ahead and add a fill here, which will be white in color, pure white actually. And we're going to, well, here we can also add variables. For example, for these it could be S, and for the vertical dimension, XS. So for all the other elements, we will simply use S, XS. Understood? And we're going to proceed to meticulously drag it into our menu item. There, we have successfully pasted it in place. Now we're going to use absolute positioning, which in Figma is this icon we have here that says Ignore Auto Layout. We are going to click on it, and then we will place it right here directly beneath our primary main menu item. So this right here would be considered our submenu, understand? So we now have a structure following good practices. We have a navigation menu with menu items that are configured using auto layout. Inside each menu item, well, we have our text, right? In this specific case, we have a menu item that has a submenu, which is why it has a vector graphic, and we have the submenu, okay? And inside the submenu, we also have menu items, and we have text. So, this is the proper method to construct our navigation menus using auto layout, following sound design principles, incorporating appropriate gaps and paddings, and enabling the application of distinct styles for various states, such as a hover state, okay? So, let's say here we already have our first menu. They're already using Fancy Figma features. Remember that in our documentation, we have our labels here to help define the type of element it is. And when we copy from Figma to Bricks Builder, all the styles are copied over, and the design transfers exactly as it appears in Figma directly into Bricks Builder, okay? Without any inconvenience. So here we have the exact same example within the Figma file that is provided with the purchase of Fancy Figma, which is a fundamental file containing all the necessary elements such as navigation menus, cards, and other components. Tabs, accordions, which are slightly more advanced elements, which are the ones we're going to cover in this course. They already have all the tags assigned, so you can just copy and paste from Figma to Bricks Builder. But the idea is you'll learn to do it in this course, okay? Fancy Guide Friends is simply going to be a comprehensive library of elements, sections, and components all designed to provide you with pre-made blocks that significantly enhance and streamline your overall workflow. But the real idea is that you know how to do all this. Obviously with good practices, auto layout, which is ideal. Now we're going to proceed and create our very first header, understood? I'm going to make this larger, and then we will continue on from there. Over here. Let's create our first navigation menu now. For example, let's just go ahead and move this over here. We're going to bring in our buttons. We'll look at this a little later, specifically the topic of the components. So I'm going to bring in a primary button here. I'm going to bring in a button. Outline, for example, this outline one. We also have outline primary, alright? We can utilize various buttons. For instance, I'm going to take out these icons. I'm going to remove this icon, remove this icon, I'll remove this icon, okay? Then, for example, I'll use these two buttons. I'm going to group them now. These two buttons, I can group them together. So I'll use Shift plus A with auto layout to incorporate a gap between them. We will be using a space gap. M. Ready? We have our space M gap. We'll position it here on the side, or in this particular instance, it will serve as a compact button for our menu. Alright, small button. So, in this particular case, this auto layout is configured with a hug content width and a hug content height, which is quite important. And in this instance, we also have it set to hug content, okay? These are some of the rare instances where we'll be utilizing an auto width rather than a fill setting, alright? We have our menu, we have our buttons, we're missing our logo. So remember that for this, it's important that it's an image, alright? We're going to use this image here that we had from the previous tutorial, alright? We have our logo. So we already have our three groups of blocks created. And for example, this one right here, this is going to be a button. Container. This here is an image. It's the logo itself. Okay, we have our navigation menu ready. So the very first thing we're going to do here is, for example, we can select everything, then press Shift plus A to apply auto layout. This will be the container. Let's set this to align center. And here we have the fact that the space, the gap, is 356. However, we can use auto to ensure there's an automatic space between these elements. Ready? This is a good option. However, what we want is for the navigation menu, in this specific instance, to be placed right next to the buttons. To do that, I'm going to unselect the very first auto layout we created. Ungroup. Alright, we have them set up again. I'm going to keep these two elements right next to each other, and then I'm going to select them and apply Shift plus A for auto layout. I'm going to label this as a navigation wrapper, okay? For example, like that. And now I'll select the two groups. Shift plus A, this will be our container. Okay, we have successfully set up our container with an auto gap. So as we can see, this will adapt automatically depending on the width. Ready? So that's why we set it to auto. For the inner content, we're going to use an M space, the same one we used for the buttons, to ensure everything is uniform. Also, if you prefer, we can apply a gap of S to the buttons, for example, making them gap S, alright? For instance, S. We can also choose to leave the navigation menu a little more spread out depending on your preferred handling and design preferences. So here we have our navigation menu, our buttons, our logo, and our container. Let's add, once again, a new one. Auto layout, which in this case would actually be a section, okay? However, This particular element is simply going to function as a container primarily because within the context of the header. It's not good practice to put sections inside the header. So we'll leave this as a section, but we'll use the div tag, okay? So we're going to use this, for example, let's just label it, for instance, main, okay? Main header. Alright. So the main header is going to have a width of 100%. Alright, we're going to transfer this over to our artboard, which already has auto layout enabled, so that we can easily apply a full 100% width to it. Now keep in mind we've covered this in previous videos. I'm just going through it quickly so it doesn't take up too much time, but indeed we have already gone over this. So in this case, the main header, which is typically the kind of section we create, let's say it will have we'll just leave this at 0 for now. But in this case, let's say it has a space M, which in this case would be a gutter, and for an extra small space on the vertical axis. So we've already got our gap set up for our container, our primary container here. We're going to tell it to have a maximum width using the variable of the content width, all right? We're going to set the section, the main header, to be centered. So this way we can also add, for example, the container tags. Okay, for example, for this one, we also have a custom logo tag that we can use. Okay, the nav menu tags can be created. For example, this one doesn't need tags, neither do these. Here we have button tags, BTN. So all this is in the documentation. However, it's just for Fancy Figma users. However, this is the proper way to create our header. So we're using good practices. We have our header, which would be our outer container. We have our primary container, which serves as our internal content holder, featuring a defined maximum width. Additionally, we have various groupings of design blocks. So in this case, we've organized everything with good practices, and we have successfully created our initial header, okay? To this, we could also add, for instance, a border to the bottom. Okay? And a colored border then. Border, all right? And so right here, we have finished our very first header. Well, that's all for now. I hope you liked this video. In the next videos, we'll keep practicing, we'll keep creating elements, we'll see more and more advanced things like accordions, tabs, sliders. So don't miss out, and I'll see you in the next videos. Goodbye.